Have you ever felt like you were lost in a maze of different philosophies, trying to figure out how all these different ideas fit together?
Yeah, it can be tough. You're not alone in that feeling, especially when you look at a figure like Elijah Del Medigo, who we're going to look at today.
Domenico was a 15th century thinker who really embodies that search for connection between seemingly different philosophies.
That's a great way to put it.
hmm
And what makes Del Medigo so fascinating, especially for us as philosophers, is that he was immersed in two pretty distinct intellectual worlds, Jewish thought and Latin Averroism.
Exactly. It's not every day that you come across someone who is so deeply involved in both of those at the same time.
Right, you wouldn't usually see those two things put together.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of why his work is so intriguing, especially if you're interested in the history of philosophy and those timeless questions about faith and reason.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. You have this really sharp mind grappling with theological complexities and at the same time engaging with the very logical, very detailed framework of Aristotelian philosophy through the lens of Averroes.
It really is a unique mix, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive. We're going to unpack Del Medigo's contributions, especially how he navigated that tricky intersection of religious belief and rational inquiry.
It's a balancing act that a lot of philosophers still struggle with today, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a perennial issue. So to help us navigate this pretty complex intellectual landscape, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Elijah Del Medigo.
It's a really thorough piece, which is great because it gives us a solid, structured base for this discussion. It's got details about his life, his work, and all the intellectual trends he was dealing with.
All right, so where do we begin with someone like Del Medigo? I guess we start with the man himself.
Right, let's start with his life and the intellectual context that shaped his thinking.
Del Medigo was born in Candia, which is present-day Heraklion, on the island of Crete, around 1458.
So geographically, already we see a potential for some cross-cultural influence, right?
Exactly. We have to remember that Crete, at the time, was a Venetian colony. This simple geographical fact actually tells us a lot about the mix of cultures that would have been present in his early life.
And it probably set the stage for the kind of intellectual synthesis that we see later on.
Absolutely. It's a crucial context. And this Venetian connection is really important because he ends up moving to Venice around 1480. We don't know exactly why, but the encyclopedia suggests he might have been trying to study medicine in Padua.
Padua was a real intellectual hub at the time, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
hugely influential, a real center of learning. So whether or not he was initially aiming for medicine, Del Medigo's time in Italy, which was from about 1480 to 1490, was his most productive period in terms of philosophy.
So it seems like even if medicine was the initial motivation, philosophy really took center stage.
It did. And even though he wasn't officially affiliated with the University of Padua, he was still a major player in the intellectual life of the Veneto region.
He was teaching philosophy, writing his own works, and he gained a lot of recognition for his translations and commentaries on the works of Averroes.
Exactly. He was a very busy and respected scholar. And it's pretty amazing to think about him in those intellectual circles, discussing philosophy with influential Christian thinkers like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Domenico Gramani.
Both of those figures became his patrons too, right?
They did. And their support really highlights how much his intellectual abilities were valued, especially his deep understanding of Averroes. I mean, these were some of the big names in the Renaissance, deeply involved in all the philosophical debates of the day.
Right, so their patronage is a pretty big deal. Then, around 1490, he decides to go back to Crete.
Yeah, it's another interesting turn in his life. And like his move to Venice, the reasons for his return are still being discussed by scholars. But the encyclopedia does suggest that he might have become uncomfortable with some of the intellectual trends that were gaining popularity in the Italian Renaissance.
Things like Neoplatonism and Kabbalah, which were becoming very influential.
Exactly. And these movements were kind of moving away from the more empirical, rationally focused Aristotelianism that Del Medigo really championed.
So in a way, his return to Crete might reflect his strong commitment to a specific intellectual tradition.
I think that's a really good point. He clearly felt strongly about these philosophical commitments. And after he went back to Crete, he wrote his most important work in Jewish philosophical thought, the Binat Hadat.
Which translates to examination of religion.
Right. And sadly, he died relatively young, around 1492 or 1493.
So we see this very interesting journey, both intellectually and geographically, starting from the edges of the Venetian Empire to its very heart during the Renaissance, and then back again.
And it's fascinating how, through all this, His engagement with the philosophy of Averroes seems to be a constant thread.
Let's talk about that more specifically then, Del Medigo as a translator and commentator of Averroes.
This is where Del Medigo really stands out as a crucial figure in the transmission of philosophical ideas. His ability to translate Averroes' work from Hebrew into Latin was absolutely key.
Because a lot of Averroes' original writings had been preserved in Hebrew translations during the Middle Ages. Right?
Exactly. So a lot of these texts weren't really accessible to the wider philosophical community in the Renaissance, who mostly read Latin. But Del Medigo's translations changed that.
So he basically opened up this treasure trove of Averroist thought for Western philosophers.
That's a good way to put it. And the list of his translations in the encyclopedia is pretty impressive. We're talking epitomes, which are these concise summaries and middle commentaries on important works like Aristotle's Meteorologica and Metaphysica.
He also translated Averroes' inquiries into Aristotle's prior analytics, selections from his commentary on De Pargibus Animalium, and even an epitome of Plato's Republic, as seen through Averroes' interpretation.
And we have to remember that translating these works wasn't a simple matter of just swapping words between languages. He needed a really deep understanding of the philosophical concepts and all the subtle nuances of both languages.
He wasn't just translating words, he was communicating really complex philosophical arguments across significant cultural and linguistic barriers.
Exactly. And even though he was part of a larger movement of translations from Hebrew into Latin, his unique expertise in both Hebrew philosophical traditions and the intricacies of the Latin scholastic world made his translations incredibly valuable.
It sounds like he was in a perfect position to bridge these two worlds.
He was. And it's important to note that he didn't stop at just translation. He also wrote his own commentaries on these texts, and even corresponded with his patrons about some of the finer points of Averroes' philosophy.
That suggests a really deep personal engagement with Averroes thought, doesn't it?
Absolutely. He wasn't just passing on information. He was actively interpreting and explaining Averroes' ideas to his contemporaries, providing context and making them relevant.
So in addition to his work as a translator, Del Medigo also produced original philosophical works during his time in Italy.
He did. And these works, as the encyclopedia tells us, were mainly focused on clarifying and expanding on Averroes' doctrines within the frameworks of Aristotelian physics, metaphysics, and psychology.
So it seems like he was more interested in refining and clarifying existing Averroist ideas than in creating something entirely new.
Yes, that's a good observation. He wasn't out to build a totally new philosophical system. He wanted to present what he believed were the most accurate and faithful interpretations of Averroes' thought.
And that approach seems to fit right in with the general intellectual trends of Paduan Averroism, a pretty important philosophical movement of the time.
It does. And it makes us think about what originality really meant in that intellectual context. It wasn't necessarily about coming up with radical new ideas. It was more about critically reevaluating established ideas, and often doing that in a very pointed, almost combative way.
Right, the encyclopedia mentions how he would often argue against previous interpretations of Averroes.
And not just from those who were completely opposed to Averroes, like Thomas Aquinas, but even from later figures within the Averroes tradition itself.
Like John of Jandun, who he seems to have taken issue with quite a bit.
Yes, John Jandun was a frequent target of his critiques. And it paints a picture of a really dynamic intellectual environment with lots of lively debate and disagreement about how to properly understand these major philosophical figures.
And to add to that, Del Medigo frequently referred to other scholastic authors in his writing, too. People like Albert the Great and William of Ockham.
He was very much situated within the broader Latin scholastic tradition.
Absolutely. So when we look at the main themes of his Italian works, we see a strong focus on some pretty foundational areas like physics and metaphysics, especially the complex issue of divine causality.
Right, and his works Quaestio de Primo Motore and Quaestio de Efficientia Mundi deal directly with this. So what were his main arguments in these works?
Well, in those works, he argued very strongly for a more nuanced view of God's role. He didn't just see God as the initial mover of the celestial spheres, but also as their efficient cause in a very specific way.
That was a point of a lot of debate within Averroism.
Yes, and Del Medigo disagreed with John of Jandun's interpretation, which saw God primarily as the final cause, the ultimate purpose or goal that everything strives for.
Instead, Del Medigo, building on Averroes, argued that God's eternal act of giving motion to the spheres actually constitutes their very being.
So he saw God as an efficient cause, but not in the sense of a creation ex nihilo, which means creation out of nothing.
It was more like an ongoing eternal causal influence. And that idea, that concept of eternal creation, is really important philosophically. It provided a way to reconcile the idea of an eternal universe with the idea of a divine creator.
Which was a pretty central tension in both philosophy and theology at the time.
A huge debate. And from this idea of divine agency, Del Medio's thinking naturally progressed to the nature of matter and form in the celestial realm.
And he believed that both earthly and celestial beings have matter and form attributed to them, but only in an equivocal sense, right?
Exactly. And this distinction is important because it avoids saying that celestial bodies are subject to the same processes of generation and corruption as things on Earth.
In Delmenigo's view, the immaterial form of the celestial spheres guarantees their eternal and unchanging movement, and God is acting as the efficient cause through this constant eternal motion.
He also tackled other complex ideas in physics, like the nature of movement itself. He argued that movement is predicated equivocally across different categories.
Which is a view that's consistent with Averroist's commentary on Aristotle's physics.
Right. And on the question of infinity, he distinguished between the potential for infinite division, which he accepted, and infinite addition, which he argued against.
He tied the idea of completion more closely to the concept of form.
And of course, we can't forget his work, De Ente et Essentia et Uno, where he dives into the classic metaphysical debate about being, essence, and unity.
Once again, siding with Averroes against Avicenna.
Right. So throughout all of his Italian works, we see a very consistent intellectual project. He was dedicated to clarifying, defending, and building on the main ideas of Averroist philosophy within the context of late medieval scholastic thought.
It's pretty impressive, really.
Now, in addition to all of that, there's also his work in psychology, which was a big area of interest for him. Most notably, his 2 investigations on the nature of the human soul.
Which he seems to have written at the request of Pico della Mirandola.
He did. It was his most substantial original work and a deep dive into the nature and the ultimate fate of the human intellect.
And this was a really hot topic in Padua at the time, wasn't it? The whole unicity controversy was raging.
It was. This debate was all about whether the material intellect is a single universal substance shared by all humans, or whether each individual has their own distinct intellect.
Pretty major question for a philosopher to grapple with, right? I mean, what does it mean to have your own individual thoughts, consciousness, and maybe even an individual soul if the ability to understand isn't even individual?
Exactly. It really gets to the heart of what it means to be human. And it had theological implications too, touching on questions of personal immortality and moral responsibility.
So Delmedigo, being Delmedigo, jumps right into the heart of this debate, right?
He does. He uses this very rigorous dialectical approach and ultimately argues in favor of Averroes' controversial idea of a single, separate material intellect.
A pretty bold move considering how much debate that view was generating.
Yeah, he systematically dismantles the arguments for multiple intellects. He refutes the idea that they are individuated materially, which was the view attributed to Alexander of Aphrodisias.
And he also refutes the idea that intellects are distinct, immaterial substances, a view often held by the theologians, who were most likely the Paduan Thomists.
Right. His method was often to use reductio ad absurdum arguments against these opposing viewpoints.
That's where you take an argument to its logical extreme to show that it leads to absurd or impossible conclusions.
Exactly. So Delmedigo used this method to demonstrate what he saw as inconsistencies or problematic consequences in these other views.
And based on this process, he concluded that the Averroist idea of a single shared intellect was the most logically sound possibility.
And then, of course, he went on to explore the relationship between the individual human being and this universal agent intellect, which is a key part of Averroes' theory of psychology.
So we can see how all of his Italian works really paint a clear picture of Delmedigo as a committed and highly skilled Averroist philosopher.
Very much engaged in all the major philosophical debates of his time. But then we have the Berinat Haddad, which he wrote after returning to Crete. This work represents a pretty significant shift in both his audience and his focus.
Right. So while his Italian works were mainly written in Latin for a Christian intellectual audience, the Berinat Haddad is written in Hebrew and is specifically addressed to a Jewish readership.
And its main goal was to create a philosophical justification for the practice of philosophy within Judaism.
Which immediately makes me think of Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, which had a very similar goal.
Exactly. And the encyclopedia points out that the Berinat Haddad is also deeply indebted to Averroist's decisive treatise, even though Del Medigo doesn't explicitly acknowledge this influence.
And that work was all about figuring out the right relationship between philosophy and religious law from an Islamic perspective.
Right. And the encyclopedia notes that there are some clear parallels between the arguments and structure of these two works.
So, in the Beshinat Hajat, Del Medigo is essentially grappling with a fundamental question for a Jewish intellectual of his time. Is studying philosophy allowed? Is it forbidden? Or is it maybe even required for a Jew who's looking for a deeper understanding of their faith?
It's a big question with some potentially controversial implications. And as the encyclopedia explains, Del Medigo's answer is actually quite subtle.
He argues that while philosophical study isn't strictly necessary for everyone in the Jewish community, it is required for those who have the intellectual capacity for it.
He believed that engaging with philosophy, when done correctly, can make religious beliefs stronger by leading to a more profound and rational understanding of creation and the Creator.
So it's not about replacing faith with reason, but about using reason to deepen faith.
That's a great way to put it. But he is also careful to define the limits of what philosophical inquiry could achieve from a religious standpoint.
Right, he emphasized the importance of faith when it came to accepting the basic principles of Judaism.
Things like prophecy, reward and punishment, and miracles, which he believed were beyond the reach of purely rational explanation.
So there are certain things that have to be taken on faith. But for those capable of engaging with it, philosophy could be a powerful tool for reaching a deeper and more accurate understanding of the Torah.
This idea of different levels of understanding, a sophisticated philosophical one for the intellectual elite, and a more traditional faith-based one for everyone else,
Mhm.
is a common theme you see throughout history when thinkers try to bring together philosophy and religion.
And it's interesting how Del Medigo spends a lot of time in this work discussing interpretations of the Torah, particularly criticizing the Kabbalistic interpretations that were getting popular at the time.
He does. He directly challenges the traditional view that the Zohar, which is a fundamental text in Kabbalah, was written by the 2nd century sage Shimon Bar Yochai.
And he argues against the more mystical and allegorical ways of reading the Torah that Kabbalists preferred.
The encyclopedia actually suggests that his main target here might have been Christian Kabbalah, which was becoming very popular in the Renaissance.
And like Maimonides before him, Del Medigo goes into detail about the reasons for the commandments in Jewish law, emphasizing their rational basis.
Even when the specific reasons might not be totally clear to us.
Right, which again contrasts with the more mystical interpretations of the commandments offered by Kabbalists.
Exactly. And he even goes so far as to analyze how rationally coherent the Christian creed is, comparing it to what he saw as the more rationally grounded principles of Judaism.
It's also interesting how Del Medigo presents Maimonides as his main intellectual guide in the Beidat Haddad.
It is. It's a noticeable shift from his earlier Italian works, where Averroist was the dominant influence.
And this change in who he seems to be aligning himself with really underlines how different the aims and audiences were for these two bodies of work.
Right? He had different goals in mind when writing for these two audiences. And naturally, this apparent shift has led to a lot of debate among scholars about Del Medigo's actual stance on the relationship between philosophy and religious belief.
Some scholars believe that he subscribed to a doctrine of identical truths, where, if properly understood, philosophy and true religion will ultimately say the same thing.
Others think he might have leaned toward a double truth theory, where you can have separate but equally valid truths in the realms of philosophy and theology.
And as the encyclopedia mentions, Frankel thinks Del Medigo was more in line with Averroist's principle that truth does not contradict truth, meaning there is a fundamental harmony between reason and revelation when both are understood correctly.
It's an ongoing debate, and there isn't a clear consensus on what his exact position was. The encyclopedia also points out that Del Medigo uses a formulation that sounds a lot like double truth in his Quaestio de Efficientia Mundi, where he appears to differentiate between religious and philosophical accounts of creation ex nihilo.
But it's interesting that he presents this almost as a side note, perhaps as a way to make things more palatable to his Christian audience at the time.
It doesn't seem like a fully developed doctrine in that work, unlike in the Bienat Hadat, so there's definitely room for more philosophical investigation into this issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when we look at Del Medigo's overall impact and legacy, it's clear that he holds a pretty unique and complex place in the history of philosophy. In his Hebrew writings, especially the Bienat Hadat, He presented himself as a Jewish sage, a follower of Maimonides' intellectual tradition.
And that's how he's mainly remembered by modern scholars, as a major figure in Jewish philosophical thought.
But the encyclopedia also highlights that Del Medigo's most significant contribution to Western philosophy as a whole probably lies in the fact that he acted as a bridge between the Hebrew and Latin Averroist schools of thought.
He was a connector, bringing different perspectives together. And through his meticulous translations and his own insightful writings, he helped to create a more unified and comprehensive understanding of Averroist's complex philosophical system.
Which then went on to have a huge impact on the Aristotelian tradition during the Renaissance and beyond.
Absolutely. And it's remarkable how his philosophical work went beyond his own religious beliefs and the specific audiences he was writing for.
He contributed to a much wider intellectual heritage. He truly was a key figure in ensuring that Averroes thought continued to be relevant and influential in Western intellectual history.
He kept that conversation going. And I think his life and his work really exemplify how philosophical inquiry can cross religious and linguistic boundaries, enriching different intellectual traditions and fostering a deeper cross-cultural understanding of the most fundamental questions in philosophy.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Elijah Del Medigo, we're left with a deep appreciation for his unique role as a link between these seemingly distinct but interconnected intellectual worlds.
He grappled with those timeless questions about the relationship between faith and reason in a way that is still thought-provoking and relevant to philosophical discussions today.
It really makes you think about the human capacity to bring together seemingly disparate systems of thought. And Del Medigo's exploration of the complexities of knowledge and belief reminds us that seeking understanding often requires looking at things from multiple perspectives.
And engaging with traditions that might seem totally different at first glance. So as you continue your own philosophical journeys, think about Del Medigo and how he bridged those worlds.
What can we learn from his approach? And how can we apply his insights to our own search for understanding in a world that often feels just as fragmented as it did in his time?
That's a great question to ponder. I think Del Medigo's life and work offer a lot of valuable insights for anyone grappling with these complex questions about faith, reason, and the pursuit of knowledge.
It's a reminder that philosophy isn't confined to one culture, language, or time period. It's an ongoing conversation that crosses boundaries and brings people together in the search for truth.
Exactly. And Del Medigo's story shows us that engaging in that conversation can lead to some truly fascinating discoveries.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep connecting those seemingly disparate ideas. You never know what insights might be waiting for you.
That's great advice. And who knows, maybe you'll even make a discovery as groundbreaking as Del Medigo's translations of Averroist.
Until next time, keep those philosophical wheels turning.
And keep diving deep.